One of my concerns is that while we are having this debate about whether humanitarian aid should be conditioned or not conditioned, the level of humanitarian aid is going down. So we won't really even need to have this debate if the donor countries just stop giving funds to Afghanistan. And we've seen enormous reductions this year from compared to last year and compared to the need. So I am one who says that the aid should not be cut. In fact, the aid should be increased, because if it's not increased, Afghan lives will be lost. Now, about the issue of conditions, of course, this is extremely important. You mentioned conditioning it on girls' education. Another big issue for both the UN system and the humanitarian community, including the NGOs, civil society, is that women workers, women staff, were prevented from delivering the aid, with some exceptions in the medical and the education sector. But this is not acceptable. This is a violation of the UN Charter when it comes to the UN. And so there need to be some red lines. There should not be any normalization of what is unacceptable or even illegal. And at the same time, the priority should be to not do any harm. I'm very concerned about the impact of poverty, lack of food, as well as education. So it's not an either or, in my opinion. It's a continuing discussion, and there should be no compromise on human rights. But at the same time, the aid needs to be delivered, and you can't deliver that aid to women and girls, and often to children, without including women staff in the delivery of the aid. Another kind of related thing that I'm concerned about is, for example, if women are not allowed to work and basically are supposed to stay at home, then who's going to take their place in the workforce? What I think we're beginning to see is children taking their place. At the same time that education is under pressure. And that raises great concerns about the future. No country should be relying on child labor and on child exploitation. Yeah, so, I think that we need all the tools available in the toolbox in the UN system. The situation for women and girls is unique. It's unparalleled anywhere else in the world, except, of course, during the Taliban's first period in power for 5 years from 1996. And it's in 2021, in the 21st century, it's necessary to use all the tools available. And I mean also the tools of accountability. And in my last report, I talked about the issue of gender persecution and gender apartheid. And I think we need to have further discussions about what that means in terms of the responsibilities of member states and the UN system. But while, I believe that accountability is necessary for justice and to bring about change, we also want to see change in positive ways. And we want to continue to make the case, not based on threats alone, but based on a strong argument that the future of Afghanistan must include a respect for all its people, regardless of their sex or of their background. Afghanistan is a very rich culture. It contains many different peoples, and that is one of its strengths. And I think this must be part of the insistence of the UN system at a political level. When you talk about member states of the EU, and they're all members of the UN, of course, as you say, and I think you mentioned, the country that you're working in, Austria, where you're based. I think I would say a couple of things. Firstly, there is a continuing human rights, humanitarian, and political crisis in Afghanistan. There is not only a moral responsibility, there's a practical responsibility. If members of the EU think that the problem can be contained within the borders of Afghanistan, I respectfully suggest that they may be mistaken on that. If the pleas from Afghanistan and about Afghanistan for human rights and respect for women's rights are not heeded, this lays the ground for very serious problems in the future that may go beyond the borders of Afghanistan. I think that members of the EU are extremely concerned about terrorism in their own countries, and they're also very concerned about large influxes of immigrants. I am not saying that this is happening now, but I think they need to keep an eye on that ball and to continue to promote respect for human rights and equality and an inclusive government in Afghanistan. Otherwise, in the longer term, there will be significant problems. I understand that many are concerned about Ukraine, and that is a fair point. It's a very serious issue. And there are other countries which are suffering conflict as well around the world. But I do call for those member states not to deprioritize Afghanistan, but rather to make it one of their highest priorities. Afghans who I talk to all the time feel abandoned. Some say to me that their biggest concern prior to 2021 was that the Taliban would get back into power and that they would be no different from the Taliban of the 1990s. And their second biggest, and that has come to pass, and their second biggest concern is that the Taliban would get back into power, be no different, and would be recognized. That, I think, is a priority concern that many Afghans tell me now. So I think that is something else to put at the door of the UN member states and of those of the EU.